Well, again, good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Insperity Business Resiliency webinar series. If we're considering the conventional definition, the U.S. certainly appears to be facing down a recession. But if we've learned anything over the last 2 years or so, there's nothing conventional about any of what we're experiencing together. There does, however, seem to be a storm on the horizon. So whether it's a passing shower or a torrential downpour, it is good to reflect on the lessons that we've learned over the last few years and gain a clear sense of understanding for the road ahead. So the reality is, even if the country is in or is heading toward an economic downturn, the playbooks of the past simply will not cut it. There are the obvious things to consider, protecting cash flow, reevaluating any unnecessary expenses, solidifying relationships with customers, and each of these are critically important in their own right. But some of the former measures that we may have been able to use in the past, should they be employed, they could do more harm than good in today's environment. So what makes this situation so unique is that there is this real talent shortage taking place in the midst of this real economic uncertainty. There's inflation, there's wage growth, there's hybrid working, all of which are driving both the demand and the opportunity for highly skilled workers in ways that really have revealed a unique challenge. There just doesn't seem to be enough people to meet this demand. And case in point, according to some of the latest reports, there are more than 11 million available jobs and only half the number of qualified workers to fill them. This reality is putting the employer in a position to have to advance on the talent front and not pull back in spite of the economic forecast. And yet, should a downturn occur, maintaining the long-term viability of the business demands that we establish a clear line of sight on the staff expense aspect of our fiscal budget, often the largest single expense category for the organization. So filling key roles and keeping engaged employees has never been more critical. So to weather this storm, we'll need to think proactively and creatively on how to manage the delicate balance between responsible long-term planning and careful short-term decision-making, and doing it all in a way that builds upon the hard work so many of us have done to strengthen our businesses to overcome whatever obstacles we might face. So that's our topic for today. Weathering the storm, proactive steps to recession-proof your business. My name is Michael Lipe, Managing Director of Brand and Marketing Strategy here at Insperity, and I'm pleased to be joined by my esteemed colleagues for today's session. Our first panelist is Kelly Yeates, Vice President, Service Operations with Insperity. Kelly leads the team responsible for the HR services that are delivered to Insperity's clients, and she brings over 25 years of HR experience spanning a broad range of human capital functions and is a senior professional and human resource SPHR certified and a certified compensation professional. Thank you, Kelly, so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning. And allow me to introduce Bryan Smith, Managing Director of Financial Planning and Analysis here at Insperity. Bryan brings more than 25 years as a certified public accountant, including 5 years in public accounting with PwC. Bryan's 10 years of Insperity have provided leadership to our organizational budgeting and planning, our SEC reporting and filing, and managing payroll, tax compliance for our clients and our company. So Bryan, thank you as well for joining us for today's session.
Thanks, Michael. Hello.
You bet. All right, so everyone can see we have some real expertise on our panel today, so let's jump right into our topic. And Bryan, I'm going to start with you. Based on some of my opening remarks, there certainly have been an interesting debate in the marketplace about whether the U.S. is technically in a current economic recession. So again, we're not going to really debate on that today, but whether we are or we aren't, many indicators are seem to be showing that we could be heading in such a direction. So should that play out, this recession would be unlike any other. As we said, there are more jobs available than people to take them. Unemployment is low, though, some are cautious, more cautious than others about whether that can hold. Interest rates are going up to battle inflation, and it's all framing a context of significant wage growth for employers. We're just dealing with this strange set of indicators and this obvious hangover from the 2 years of the pandemic. So there certainly are mixed messages in the marketplace, but assuming for today's discussion that an economic downturn is on the horizon, how should business leaders begin preparing for such a situation given where we are today?
Yeah, Michael, and thanks everybody. It is a unique situation. I think I'd like to start maybe, there was a slide that Mercer had pulled together recently, and I wanted to pull that up. I found a few things interesting in it. First and foremost, it looked into what do they think executives, what's on their minds, given what they faced in 2020 and 21 with COVID and, the anticipation of a downturn, possibly happening, what's on their minds. And kind of first and foremost, I found interesting was, attracting and retaining talent was a top concern for executives in this tight labor market. And so while, executives will be, are looking at, at the top there was reduce operational costs, right? You're always looking to, pare your expenses if there's going to be a downturn to kind of help your cash flow. But, what I found interesting, there were, 4 or 5 of these were, executives were looking to increase their investment during this time period, not, cut costs. They mentioned strategic partnerships, automation, kind of reskilling your employee base to, handle different tasks and be able to pivot quickly. And then obviously, having a variable staffing model, anytime you can shift your mix from variable expenses to, from fixed expenses to variable, that's helpful. So I want to keep this slide up, and I'm just going to touch on a few kind of financial areas as we kind of, go through this list. And kind of the first one I want to touch on first and foremost is liquidity, right? Very important in all times, but certainly important during a downturn. And so when I think about liquidity, I think about, cash you have on hand, how much surplus do you have, as well as, how much operating cash flows do you have, or how much liquidity or borrowing capacity do you have in the future? You think about, every business is different, but, you could look at, do I have a 6-month reserve to covering operating expenses, 3 months? What is that, and kind of what's a good position for us to be in? So always, that's where I would start. Especially given, like Michael mentioned, that the Federal Reserve has increased rates a few times already to fight inflation. I think it's anticipated there's going to be several other ones as they try to fight it off further and kind of to stem that. So when that happens, the credit markets tend to tighten up during these slowdowns. And because of that, if you have a need to increase or to obtain a credit facility or to increase your facility, it may be the time to look at that now versus a year from now. If things worsen, it's going to be more difficult to have that additional capital or sources of liquidity when you need it most. That's kind of the first area I wanted to talk about. And secondly, as you think about liquidity and cash management, and sometimes companies don't think about their working capital that they have on hand. When I say working capital, you think of areas like your accounts receivable, your inventories, your accounts payable, right? And so anything you can do to shorten the time to convert your working capital to cash would be helpful always, but in particular in a downturn, if you need to kind of increase your cash flow opportunities. And this is a simple example I would give, but an important one is, with your accounts receivable, sometimes companies will offer a discount to their customers to pay early. So if you're having trouble with your receivables during that time, excuse me, that may be an area to, speed up collection. Another, once you kind of taking a look at your liquidity needs and kind of your sources, then I would say you need to focus on a cash flow analysis and have different scenarios for that cash flow analysis. When I say that, is I would think of, having scenarios with different revenue scenarios. Okay, here's my current kind of revenue run rate. What happens if it drops 10%, 20%? What do I need to do, and what does that look on my cash liquidity? And when you do that, you need to think about different expenses and how do you view those expenses? And I would say, one way to look at it is try to categorize your expenses into different buckets. And the first one I would say is, what are the very easy expenses that can be cut in the short term that wouldn't take a lot of effort? Another bucket you could put it in is, here's our expenses I could cut, but it's going to take changes in my processes to get it done, but it may not be that painful if we do that. And I think of an examples like travel expenses, especially during COVID, like during the lockdowns, that was an easy process to change. And less people traveled, it was an easy win from that aspect. And then kind of the last bucket I would think of is kind of the hard decisions you need to make. Headcount reductions obviously would be, one of those. And then finally, kind of an area on here, they mentioned is strategic investments and acquisitions. And I mean, these are definitely an opportunity to take advantage of the market right now. And when you make these type of decisions, it needs to be driven, like use a return on investment analysis. But a lot of times the things I was just talking about are cost savings or kind of defensive measures during a downturn. But these strategic investments are more of an offensive measure, you could say. And you have the ability to increase market share during this downturn. If you make these, good strategic investments. And also there's other companies or competitors, they may be only thinking on the defensive side. And if that's the case, this is an opportunity maybe where you could go in and kind of take a bite out of it, and get additional market share during this time if you're strategic about it. I think I've said enough on that, so I'm going to just turn it back over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. That's really good, very sound advice. And Kelly, I want to turn to you. We just discussed many of the kind of sound principles or some of those fundamentals that we need to strengthen anticipation of a downturn, particularly in areas where expenses or variable costs need to be controlled. But how should we view the role of culture in such determinations? And how do we think about the decisions we make and the priorities we focus on during such times that either can reinforce or even contradict the culture that we've tried so hard to build and maintain over the last couple of years? Thoughts there?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That's a great question. I would say that thinking about your organizational culture is key when considering any decision that will impact your workforce, not just when there's a downturn. We've really seen over the last couple of years the importance that companies' attention to their culture and their mission and their values have when there's a challenging time, and how that really helps an organization be better prepared to weather those times. And it's really in these times that we get to live out the values that we've underscored over the many years we've been in business. Our employees watch closer also to see if our words align with our actions when things get difficult. So when I think of all the factors that have arisen really just since 2020 that impact our workforce, I think it's fair to say that many businesses actually have stronger cultures today, which is a really good thing going into maybe a more uncertain economic future. And that's because they've invested that time and the resources to help their workforces really feel connected and supported. So I think it's important to think about the impact on your culture if investments in your workforce are cut in response to a downturn. So for example, perhaps you've invested in developing a DE&I program over the last couple of years. And maybe those efforts are some of the first to be cut back on or tabled due to budget constraints. Well, that sends a message to your workforce about priorities, even though you probably don't intend to convey any such message. So this is where that communication is really important, and that you share as much as you can about your plans, maybe the time-bound nature of decisions that you're making, and your reasoning with your workforce. Going back to the example of trimming costs from, let's say, a DE&I program, a good start would be to state up front to your workforce that you have a continued commitment to that program, and then explain why there may be impacts and ask for their ideas for ways that you can still continue the program in a more budget conscious way. I've found over time that our team members they usually already have great ideas for how we can do things more effectively or efficiently, and sometimes they're just waiting for us to ask. I'll also add to what you said, Bryan, about leveraging a downturn to increase your investments, specifically in the area of strategic talent. We've seen from past downturns that top talent will always have opportunities, irrespective of the job market or the economy. So this may be that key opportunity to gain talent that just wasn't available to you 6 months ago. Just yesterday, Bryan, Michael, as you mentioned, we saw the news release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that we've got over 11 million job openings, and we still have 5 million fewer unemployed workers to fill those. So we've got way more job openings than we have workers. And still in July alone, 4 million workers left their jobs. So that tells us that people still feel comfortable enough to switch jobs for better pay or working conditions. And Bryan, you also mentioned investing in developing skill sets. I think now is a key time to focus on training specifically for your frontline managers. Really at the heart of any culture is that relationship that employees have with their boss. And just like what we've seen through COVID, during challenging times, employees typically need more time and communication with their managers. So training and support for your frontline leaders is really key to maintaining your culture through a difficult period.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to the point you made specifically about communication. I think that's an area of real opportunity here. And Bryan, I'll turn this to you. Different business leaders take different approaches when it comes to sharing and communicating openly about their financial, situation, particularly with frontline managers and employees. Some may be, somewhat close to the vest, and others may be an open book. And there's no right or wrong answer there necessarily. But when considering the impact, or perhaps more importantly, the perceived impact that a coming recession might have on a company's financial position, how should business leaders really think about that when it comes to sharing information that can impact overall engagement?
Right. Yeah, good question. I would think, I'm a finance person from my perspective, so take it for what it's worth. Probably not the best communicator, but if I were going to communicate this to my employee, I would try to focus on kind of the macroeconomic factors. Okay, what's in play right now? What are we really struggling with? So, and I would try to link those to specific initiatives that the company is going to implement to try to, weather the storm or handle this downturn. Okay, so I think linking, what's happening in the industry and overall the economy to what these initiatives are is important, just to kind of get that link. Again, I think I used travel before, but this is a simple example, but if there's an initiative where the company wants to, cut their travel expenses in the short term, right? 50, 60, whatever percent they need to. Well, you can kind of link it back to, everybody watches the news. It's all over it that fuel prices are through the roof. Nobody can, cost of airline tickets, the cost of travel, it just is exorbitant. So, that's an easy, simplistic way I'm trying to say is how do you kind of link that back to the employees? Another thing I think is important, I think, Kelly, touched on about engaging your employees, but I think, to the extent you can, engage them and try to get their feedback on, they see these same concerns in the economy and they could probably see it on your business. Well, engage them. What could they do, or what kind of recommendations do they have that can kind of, help things in the short term or the near term? I think the more buy-in you get from your employees on that, the better it is. And they feel like they got skin in the game there. And then kind of a final point would be just to, you got to think about balancing this information. Like, you got to give them enough financial information, right? So they can kind of understand what's going on and why you're doing it and why it makes sense. But you kind of have to somewhat thread the needle, because you don't want to give too much information, right? That, jeopardizes any long-term strategic plans or those kind of ideas that need to stay with, the executive management team. So that's a tough one that you kind of have to think about from, each business and kind of where you are. But I think those are kind of three areas you could focus on with communication.
Yeah, that's good. Really helpful. Kelly, I think we can't overemphasize this point about communication. And I think people tend to act, funny or suspicious when they feel that information is being withheld from them. Sometimes they may default to the worst case scenario. So from an HR practitioner's perspective, what are some of those warning signs that would indicate that maybe the appropriate level of communication is lacking?
Yeah, I can't hear the word communication, Bryan, or Michael, without thinking about that quote, that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. I think that sums up so many of our challenges with communication. So when we talk about the appropriate level of communication, that's really tough to define, because our employees, as the receivers of that information, may have a very different perspective on what we share with them than what we intended or thought we shared with them. So let's go to Bryan's hypothetical company initiative to temporarily reduce travel due to the higher fuel costs. That seems very straightforward. But your employees may feel like there's more to the story, because maybe they recall during the 2008 recession, travel was reduced, and then 6 months later, there was a round of layoffs in a specific division. So our human nature is to connect dots with the information that we have and to fill in any gaps in typically a more negative manner than positive. And I think it's really important that we understand what's happening at that level with our employees, maybe just even on a psychological level, how they might react when they feel like they don't have the whole story. So let's take a look at that Mercer survey data again. There's an interesting nugget I want to point out there. So this is going back to the same survey that Bryan referred to earlier. It's Mercer's 2022 Global Talent Trends Survey. And we see here a list of reasons that workers said would cause them to stay, reasons they stay with their employer. And the number one reason that they stay with their employer this year is because of job security. And what's interesting is that several of the reasons that people choose to stay with their employers have changed significantly this year compared to prior years, but not the reason of job security. Over several years, job security has stayed either number one or number two on this survey, as well as many of the other surveys that everyone's probably seen. And that's likely because having that sense of security is really important to calming that part of our brain that's always scanning the environment to see if we're safe and we can focus our attention on other things. It's called the amygdala, and it's that fight or flight. It's always looking, just like we learned with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have to feel like our safety and security needs are in place before we're really able to engage ourselves at those higher levels. So all of that said, it helps if you can be candid with your employees when there's information that you're not at liberty to share. And there will be things that the timing's not right, or maybe they're just unknown factors. But to help assure your employees that they have your commitment, that when you have information that you can share, you will, especially if it impacts them, and that you're also interested in their best interest as well as making good decisions for the business. So one thing that I think about is with communication is that dreaded rumor mill. And we can do things like setting up recurring communication across channels. Let's pull up our communication slide. So these are ideas that we've probably all heard before, but I think it's important to recap them in this context. When we think about a variety of communication channels to stay connected with our workforce, especially when times may be more difficult, I think about things like doing corporate culture surveys and pulse surveys. We really saw a lot of utilization of pulse surveys during COVID. And those are those temperature checks that you can do, a couple of questions with your workforce on a recurring basis to be able to trend out how they're feeling. Do they feel like they have information? Are there questions that are unanswered? And then another medium that you can use are stay interviews. And those are interviews that you have with your current employees one-on-one to find out what factors might cause them in the future to consider looking into another opportunity outside of the company, and how you can get in front of those types of issues before an employee ever starts to look outside the organization. It also just gives you a really good idea about what's top of mind for them as far as concerns with what's going on with the business. If you don't already do regular town hall or company meetings, those are great avenues just to have a cadence of communication that your employees can expect, especially if employees can submit questions for you to answer during those times. And then I'll go back to training your managers. Those frontline managers, there's just no way to overstate how important they are to equip them to be more connected with their team members, train them on how to address those employee relation issues that usually come up more. We've seen that in prior downturns, that employees' personal worries and concerns typically don't stay outside the walls of the business. They typically come to work with them, and that can lead to things like conflicts between team members, performance management, or productivity issues. And so if you have resources for your employees, like an EAP or mental health care support, financial health resources, remind and encourage employees frequently that those resources are available. And if you don't have those resources, it's really worth looking into whether they might be a good investment for your organization. We offer these resources to our clients here at Insperity and our corporate staff, and we have just heard so many testimonials about the positive impacts that these resources have had on employees.
Yeah, that's so important, particularly the financial wellness as we think about the topic for today. It's not just the business that's, potentially evaluating expenses. It's also people, it's individuals and families. So having those kind of resources to help bridge that gap for people can be invaluable in your ability to keep them engaged and committed to your purpose. So Bryan, let's talk about that a little bit more on the topic of engagement. And certainly we're in a post-pandemic era that is certainly complex from a talent strategy standpoint. We've talked about that. I think everybody's feeling that. When facing a potential economic downturn, in light of what we've been through, having those engaged, committed employees are really more critical than ever to care for customers, right? Who are, customers are likely going through their own set of evaluations, right? So how should the folks on our call today really think about things like cost of customer acquisition and retention, as a key driver of their financial performance in the midst of all this?
Yeah, good question. I would say when I think of customer acquisition and kind of customer retention, right, in those two buckets, right, and if there's a downturn or a recession, trying to get new customers just became even more difficult, clearly. And when you think of customer acquisition, right, you think of there's a lot of upfront costs to that. There's marketing costs, there's other selling costs, you got commissions. There's just a number of things. The cost to try to get a new customer is an investment. And as you think about that, you think about, like you said, Michael, companies are going through their own analysis of expense reductions, but how can they save in the short or near term or long term, whatever it is? They're less likely to potentially spend or go out there and get a new vendor. So that makes customer retention, while it's always important, it is extremely important during this downturn. You're going to have a downturn. You don't want to lose your customers that you already have. You may not be able to recoup it in the short term or the near term.
Right.
So you got to focus on that. And so when you think about your existing customer base, let's kind of use the old 80-20 rule, right? 20, and that would be your top customers basically account for the majority of your revenue, right? So those existing customers need to be your focus, and you need to have engaged employees with that are focused on customer satisfaction. And that it becomes one of their most important things, right? And their job duties is we got to keep these customers. And then, I think it's important for your employees to, as they engage their customers, to, they have a good relationship with them and they get their feedback, right? And what's going on with your customer right now? I think that's really important to see. Okay, well, your customers are going through the same downturn. They're having the same challenges you are. Learn from them. Have your employees reach out to them. And what are they doing, or are they really hurting? And if they're really hurting, so I need to think about go back to my scenario model.
Mm-hmm.
I need to, do I need to reduce my revenues to 10%? I'm losing a major customer, or they're not going to be able to have as many orders, using a general term, in the near term. And I also think of the 80-20 rule as it relates to kind of efficiency of your employees. Mm-hmm. If your existing customer base, you may have, customer service issues, right? And the 80-20 rule, it seems like, 20% of your customers take up 80% of your time, right? And you're having to deal with. And so in a downturn, you don't, it's a tight labor market. Employees are, trying to get talent is hard. Trying to keep your talent is hard. And so it's a scarce resource. So you don't want them spending all their time on 20% of your customers, on the bad customers, you need to focus on what's important right now, even more so than typically done in your business. So that's kind of where I would say, that's how I view customer acquisition versus, client retention, and kind of how do you balance that? And what do you look at during a recession?
Yeah, that's really good advice. I'm looking at some of our questions that have been submitted. I'd like to pose a couple of these to you guys. Okay. Kelly, these may be angled towards you, but Bryan, please feel free to jump in as well. So the question is, do you have any suggestions on how to retain staff when budget dollars are tight? Either one of you have a direct answer there?
Yeah, I can start with that one, Michael. As we just talked about, we see more job openings than unemployed people in the labor market. And so that means employees are likely going to maintain their balance of power in the job market. And that makes it really tough on salary budgets. And while comp and benefits are clearly important, and as Bryan's talked about, there are ways you can address compensation through variable pay that don't add to your fixed cost. Comp and benefits really are not enough. Employees, from what we've heard over the last couple of years, they really want to, it's important to them to have the experience that they expect to have as a human in the workplace, as someone that is an individual, not just a number. So having things like clear opportunities for career advancement, doing things to help employees feel a sense of community and belonging with your organization, and then helping them to see the impact and meaning and purpose in their work are really important too. Sometimes when employees are looking for other opportunities, those are things that may be missing components that you can speak to. There are other non-financial components, things like increased flexibility. And what I mean there is not just remote work, but really alternative scheduling, such as a 4-day work week, where maybe you do 4 10-hour days, or maybe a person's work can be completed in 4 days. And things like opportunities to develop new skill sets, special project assignments. There are really just a variety of ways that you can look to, I would say it's just as part of your total rewards program, consider different things than just your financial compensation.
That's good.
Yeah, and Michael, I'll jump in real quick, and I'm going to go back to Kelly's slide earlier when and we don't have to pull it up, but I found it interesting in there when they talked about what's gone up and down spots, right, based on different time frame of surveys. The one that really stuck out to me, and when I saw it a couple of weeks ago, is career advancement, right? And I think equate that to people want to make more money, right? Advance up the ladder. There you go. Thank you. Number 7, opportunity. That surprised me that it went down 4, and I think it goes to you. Like, people are thinking about other things right now, and things that are important to them. And I think we had over the summer, we had some interns, right? That interned with us, and just talking with them, I got a chance to things that are important to them are not what was important to me back when I was their age or entering the market or in the labor force, and community involvement and kind of having groups. And so as you think about, it's not always about, I got to pay my employees 10% more to keep them and everything. There's other ways to look at that. And that just stuck out with me on that slide from earlier. So that's all I had to add.
That's good. Thank you. So here's another question, paraphrasing here. It says that they're noticing that some of their employees are worried about inflation and economic impact. It seems to be coming up in the office in discussion. So do either of you have guidance on how this individual should respond to those issues and potentially, as distractions too?
Yeah. So I'll emphasize something that Bryan said earlier. Our employees see the same news, and they feel the same economic impacts that all the rest of us do every time they fill up their gas tank or pay their electric bill. So no one's immune to seeing some of the changes that are taking place in the economy. And so we can expect to see that there are going to be increasing signs of stress and tension, and these are going to come up in conversations and also in other ways like conflicts. So I know I sound like a broken record, but really equipping your managers to have time to do regular check-ins with their employees. And one thing that's important is when things get more stretched, managers tend to have more on their plates. And so sometimes their prioritization of time with their employees can fall down lower than where they would hope for it to be. So ensuring that you're allowing your managers to have that critical time is important. Sharing all of those resources about EAP, emotional health, financial wellness resources. And then also exploring things like ways that you can help to maybe offset some of the financial impacts. So maybe you can offer an additional remote work day that helps to offset your employees' transportation or dry cleaning cost, or maybe an alternative schedule that would allow employees to not have to pay for after-school daycare. And so maybe they can save, $1,000 a month by not having that expense, and they can log back on in the evening and complete their day. So things like that. I would also throw in that we have seen just an incredible impact in our own workplace through our partnership with a charitable organization to have a care fund for our employees that helps them when they have an unexpected financial need during a hard time. And so I know there are a lot of organizations that will partner with businesses to have such a program that helps an employee make it through a time that they just didn't expect and plan for.
Yeah, that's really good. And I would encourage the Insperity clients that are on the call today to, if those are questions that you have, let's work with your team to figure out how to address those practically so that you have access to these kinds of resources continually. Thank you for the questions. One other question that's frequent is that, is this session being recorded and will be available? Yes, it is being recorded and it will be available on Insperity.com under our resources section later today. So be sure to check that out if you'd like to watch a replay of this session. I want to turn now to something that, again, a lot of what we're talking about today is weatherproofing our businesses, trying to weather the storm that may be coming, whatever that may be. And I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about some of the difficult conversations that come around this topic, but it's important to proactively think about it. So, whether the company is in growth mode or in transition mode, we've been navigating the hybrid working, the remote working, all of those things that we've been dealing with relative to our commitments to well-being in the workplace. But it's during those downtimes when the human resource function really does become particularly essential, especially if the company is having to consider what we might think of as a reduction in workforce. There are a number of factors, regulatory and otherwise, that come into play here that can make all the difference in how a company comes out of the other side of this difficult season. So Kelly, I'd like to ask you if you can unpack some of those for us on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. But before we get there, let's first talk for a moment about the importance of exhausting all other options before you get to that point of layoffs. And why I say that is layoffs have this long-standing negative impact that usually lasts well past whatever the economic condition is. I'll refer to an article that the Harvard Business Review published back in 2018. And it looked at previous downturns and companies that implemented layoffs. And it showed that when companies had layoffs, it resulted in a huge uptick, up to 30% increase in voluntary turnover the following year. And there are other impacts too. So employees that remain after a layoff typically feel a loss of job satisfaction. They typically say that they feel less committed to the organization, and they say that they see declines in their own job performance. And so all of those factors can lead to declines in your customers' experience, like Bryan talked about. And it's a critical time to keep your customers and keep those relationships intact. You can also see increases in workplace safety issues when you have fewer people doing the same jobs, or just people that are distracted because they have those concerns. So there's a long list of alternatives to layoffs that you see here on the slide. We're probably all aware of these, but let's take just a minute to refresh our memories on these things. So let me talk about just a few of these that have specific compliance considerations. So let's look at pay reductions, for example. So it's really important, if you're considering pay reductions, that you be sure that for your non-exempt employees that they're kept above the federal, state, and local minimum wage, and that for your exempt workers that their salaries don't fall below the federal and state minimum thresholds. I would also say that employees should always be notified about pay reductions in advance. And some states actually have notice requirements that you must give to employees a certain number of days before you reduce their pay. And then from a compliance perspective, you want to be sure that there's no adverse impact to any specific group of employees, and that you're still maintaining attention to pay equity specifically in states where there are pay equity laws that you have to comply with. So another alternative to think about is 401k matching program, maybe doing some temporary reductions there. I would say approach that in a cautionary manner because it's just a general time when employees are probably feeling less certain about their future plans and their ability to retire. So making sure that you try to make those decisions as time-bound as possible. And then looking closely at which of your benefits and perquisites are really utilized and valued by your workforce. And if you have some that are less utilized, less valued, now might be a good time to think about discontinuing those. Going back to our cross-training discussion earlier, having employees cross-trained to be able to step into other divisions if there's a downturn in their workload where they can just redeploy. We saw a lot of companies do this during COVID, and it really kept a lot of companies afloat, just the ability to redeploy their talent to other parts of their company. But if layoffs do become inevitable at some point in your organization, there are some key steps you can take that will help to mitigate some of the stress and disruption. Layoffs are always going to be stressful and disruptive, but there are some steps you can take that also can limit your exposure to liability. So let's look at our next slide. So the best approach, in my opinion, to reductions in force is to consider the parameters. And I would say, if possible, to approach your layoffs in what I'll say a more surgical manner as opposed to across the board. And why I say that is because much of the research shows that when layoffs are very specific to a division or a job function, it's easier to explain that and justify that to your workforce. And typically it's going to have less of an overall impact to your employee morale and engagement. And also think about whether you can make your layoffs temporary. You'll hear temporary layoff or the word furlough used. Those mean the same thing. They're used interchangeably. And they just refer to defined time periods when employees are not working. I would say a note of caution there is that when you do furlough an employee, that can interfere with their ability to receive unemployment income if you're bringing them on and off again. And we saw some of those impacts during COVID, that employers just weren't aware that they were actually causing their employees to not be able to receive what they might otherwise from their unemployment. And I would say look at your policies. Now's a good time to do that before you're ever at a point of considering layoffs. Make sure that if you have policies in place, that you're aware of those policies so that you can follow them consistently. And if you have policies in place now that you think are not viable for the future, go ahead and make revisions to those. Things like outplacement services, if you'll provide that service for people who are laid off, if you'll provide severance payments, and if you will provide those severance payments, are they based on certain factors like number of years of service? And then how you'll treat unused PTO balances. And whether you'll provide references or letters of recommendation. That can be a big distraction for managers if they're getting those requests afterwards. So letting employees know upfront what they can expect as far as a reference or letter of recommendation. And then identifying your decision criteria. This is really probably at the nexus of your decision. So that criteria should be measurable and objective, and it should be based on a specific factor, like a business unit, a job function, seniority or performance rating. And I cannot overstate how critical it is to be consistent in applying the criteria and doing your analysis to ensure that there's no adverse impact on any specific group of employees. And it's also important to document how you arrived at those decisions. I guarantee you, a year later, you're not going to recall the minutia of those discussions and decisions. And that is likely, if you're going to receive litigation or something of that nature, it's usually months down the road. And then I would say that when you choose that layoff criteria, stick to it. Be consistent, make sure you do not stray from the criteria that you've chosen, because the last thing that you need is the liability and distraction of an EEOC charge when you're trying to navigate through a downturn. And then finally, consider whether you have the need to comply with any regulatory requirements. I've listed some of those here on our slide. The Federal WARN Act That typically applies to employers with 100 or more employees and requires 60 days notice before a mass layoff or business closing. And also be aware that several states also have their own version of WARN Acts. Some states also have laws that require employees to be given notification on how to file for unemployment. And then the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act may apply to you if you have at least 20 employees and are laying off at least one employee who's age 40 and over, and you're asking that laid off employee to sign a severance agreement and release of claims to release their rights under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. And then payday laws, making sure that you comply if your state requires you to pay an employee sooner than the next payday. So to sum it up, Michael, there is a long list of considerations and a lot of work ahead for employers if they ultimately need to go down this path.
Yeah, thank you for taking us through that. There is a lot of detail there, and it's important that we understand that so that we're prepared and can be proactive about the steps that we can take, hoping that is, in fact, we've used every other opportunity to avoid that situation if possible. But thank you, Kelly, for the detail. Bryan, I want to kind of go back to some of where we were when we started. We talked about this idea of the importance of categorizing expenses and maintaining, cash liquidity and some of the primary measures that you recommended. One of those options, there's a focus could be, identifying the right kind of outsource solutions as part of that mix. So what kind of criteria would you advise the business leaders on the call here today to use when thinking about an outsourced solution for a specific business function?
Well, I would, if you, take a look in the past and, different downturns or recessions. I mean, I think the outsourcing industry in general has done, well during that time frame. So people do look at that model, even more so during that time. I would just say you need to kind of look at areas that are, not your obviously your key business processes. You want to keep that in-house. You want to keep that with your employees. But if there's certain, non-essential functions, and I know that's kind of vague, but, things that just aren't key or core to your business, take a look at that. Or there's certain areas maybe where you need specific technical expertise that, maybe it's not in your wheelhouse. That's another area you could look at that, this could be more cost efficient than hiring full-time employees. You got to do a cost analysis and say, and I would start with comparing outsourcing it versus keeping it in-house. And usually outsourcing contract labor is going to be more expensive than employees in general. But you have to factor in other costs as well. You got a lot of benefit costs with employees. You got a lot of other costs with employees that you wouldn't necessarily have with contract labor. And then kind of more to the point of kind of a variable versus fixed model, I think what I mentioned earlier is, well, if you have contract labor in certain these areas during a downturn, right? And your full-time employees, you got to pay all the time. It's a fixed cost, what I would say. And use contract labor in certain areas, and might help you from a profitability standpoint, even more so during a downturn when you don't have as much activity or need for it. You're only paying for the hours used. So I know that's pretty quick and high level, but I think those, as I think about, those two models, that's how I view it.
Yeah, and particularly during a tight labor market, considering the outsourced solutions that are appropriate for your business can really be a solution to overcome that challenge. So thank you, Bryan. So Kelly, I'm going to begin to close out our time here today. And I want to return to a point that you made a little bit earlier. And that really is all about the culture that we want to build and maintain and sustain, particularly if we're facing down times. And often our people will surprise us with the discretionary effort that they give when they're empowered with the right information and given something to fight for, right? So how would you describe the power of that idea when it comes to building a company's resilience?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the power of discretionary effort, Michael. I've looked at a lot of research about the best performing companies during prior downturns. And what I see is there are common behaviors that led to resiliency and success for the companies that really persevered throughout the downturns. Some of those things are that they set clear goals that their employees could rally around. So they were very clear and gave that focus to their employees so they could all rally around that. And they created typically small cross-functional teams and empowered those teams with decision-making authority and flexibility to go forward and conquer whatever lay ahead. And that kind of autonomy really is key when people need to be nimble and react quickly. I would also say that it's important to share your stories. So if your organization weathered the last downturn well, and you didn't have to do layoffs, or even if you did, and you were able to reinstate those workers, now's a good time to remind your workforce of those shared experiences and what you've overcome together in the past. There's so much emotional power in the stories, especially for those that are newer to the workforce and maybe haven't experienced a significant downturn in their adult life. There are also activities that you can do to help your teams mentally prepare for the challenges ahead. A business author that I really enjoy is Daniel Coyle. He writes books on organizational culture like The Culture Code. And he has an exercise that he suggests doing that he calls a pre-mortem exercise to build your team's resiliency. And I've done this many times myself. He says that you have your employees imagine that it's 1 year from now and your company is in a really bad spot and nothing has worked out. And then ask them what happened that caused that to occur. And there's something about the exercise of naming those factors that can help them to identify the barriers and opportunities and mentally prepare them so they can recognize those and navigate through them if they occur in the future. So really, to sum it up, it all goes back to having the right talent and taking the steps to build a strong culture. These are areas that have remained a continual focus here at Insperity. Our leaders have really been intentional about creating what we call a culture by design and not a culture by default. And I know I'm a little biased, but I'm really proud of the success that we've achieved with that approach, not just in our own organization, but in the thousands of businesses that we've helped to create strong and resilient workforces.
Well, thank you. That's I share that excitement and that optimism about the opportunity ahead of us. So thank you, Kelly and Bryan, for sharing these insights with us today. And thank you all for joining us and for the questions that you submitted and the time that you've given to our session today. In closing, Kelly, I really want to go back and echo that point that you made, that it's during times of uncertainty where those organizational values are really given that chance to rise to the occasion. And certainly no one welcomes a crisis, but such times, they provide leaders with the ability to really solidify, who they are and what they stand for and the principles that they strive to uphold in both good times and in challenging ones. So, this series, the Insperity Business Resiliency Webinar Series, continues to be a means by which small and mid-sized business leaders can come together and talk through some of the most pressing issues that we're facing during these unprecedented times. So let me encourage you to use this opportunity to wrestle through some of these topics with your leadership team, perhaps doing some of the exercises that Kelly recommended, and reaching out to your business network. Reach out to that inner circle, those trusted advisors that you have in your community, and to learn how other companies like yours are considering and preparing for the possibilities ahead. At Insperity, our goal is always to help you reinforce that inner circle by bringing the very best human resource solutions and strategies to you and your team to help you think through how to build and sustain a culture that can thrive even amid uncertainty. So we would be honored to introduce you to one of our nationwide network of business performance advisors dedicated to helping be that very thing for you and your team. Let me encourage you to visit Insperity.com today and explore the many ways that we've helped businesses just like yours weatherize their business, protecting it from both those external risks and enhancing it to be a great place for your employees to work and succeed in every endeavor. So again, thank you for joining us. Please join us for our next session of the Business Resiliency Webinar Series on Wednesdays, September 14th at 10 a.m. And we're going to dig deeper into the topic on the war for talent. We touched on it today, but we're going to get into a more specific conversation there. It's obviously another issue, primary issue that we're all facing. And we'll explore ways to help you build and sustain an employer brand that is distinct in the marketplace and can be a magnet for the industry's best and brightest. So I'm looking forward to that. Until then, hope you have a wonderful week, and we look forward to talking to you then. Thank you.